So recently, watching a book haul video by Lady of the Library, she had two books that I would not have given a second glance or considered reading before I started doing BookTube. But now that I'm doing BookTube, I was very intrigued by the titles of these books, which are How to Talk About Books You Haven't Read by Pierre Bayard, and How to Really Talk About Books You Haven't Read by Henry Hitchings. Because a lot of the channel, a lot of what I've been doing, is sort of talking about books that I haven't read yet that I'm going to read, or books that I just read but I should have read forever ago, because there's just so many things I want to read and I've talked about, and this book particularly gets to a lot of things I talked about, and I'll get to that. But I've talked about, like, the more I read, the more I realize that I don't know, and so my TBR list grows exponentially longer. And anyways, so Lady of the Library, she was early in my channel, one of my most overlapped channels, and she still overlaps frequently, which doesn't really surprise me. A lot of similarities, both neurodivergent people. She got her PhD in classics. I didn't get my PhD in linguistics, but had struggles, sort of critical of academic culture, and especially of like gatekeeping narratives around books. And the fact that she is so large and growing so rapidly gives me hope that I can also get there. I mean, she has two things I don't, one of which is she's a lot better at speaking off the cuff, but I feel like I've got a lot better at that over the last few months, so hopefully I'll get there too. And one of them is the credentials, which I don't have, but I also look at, there's people who have even less claim to credentials than I do, just confidence. So anyways, so the reason I was actually watching this video, because I don't usually watch book haul videos, but so in my video on essays, I have not been checking comments regularly, but I occasionally, especially if a video is underperforming and I don't have as many comments, I will. And so that happened with my video on essays, at least initially. And I checked some of the comments, and someone was recommending that I read Susan Sontag, which was a great recommendation, thank you. But anyways, I had always sort of had the impression there's like a cluster of these writers that baby boomers really like my parents' generation, so Norman Mailer, John Updike, Gore Vidal, and Susan Sontag. And at least with Norman Mailer, I sort of get the impression that he's like the literary equivalent of the film The Graduate, which is basically sort of a navel-gazing, like boomer, kind of narcissistic thing that really only works if you're from that time, in that time. And I don't know if that's true. I don't know if I'm being fair to Norman Mailer. That's just the impression that I got of him. And so I sort of associated Gore Vidal, John Updike, and Susan Sontag, and I think a couple of other writers from that generation, that time too, by association. And so reading Susan Sontag and realizing, oh, she is actually, I'm glad I'm reading her, and I'm going to, 4th of July video, I'll reference at least one of her essays. And early in the channel, someone was talking about how much they loved Gore Vidal, which was when I first sort of questioned, is my taxonomy of Norman Mailer, John Updike, Gore Vidal, Susan Sontag, and people like that as being similar writers, is that accurate, or am I sort of unfairly grouping them based on the people who read them? Maybe not even being all that similar, but just to my mind, being people from my parents' generation who have certain annoying boomer qualities. Which actually gets to one of the big ideas in this book, How to Read Books You Haven't Read by Pierre Bayard, where so I actually noted a couple of quotes I might want to make here, but one of the big takeaways for me is that, so this book, the format is there's 12 chapters, 4 in each of 3 sections, and in each of these sections he develops sort of what I would call like a library of the mind, like a different category. So in the first section he talks about what he calls the collective library, in the second section what he calls the inner library, and the third section what he calls the virtual library. And the collective library is basically our understanding as a culture of like various books and how they relate to each other. And then the inner library is our individual understanding of books, whether we have read them or not. And then the virtual library comes out of our interactions with other people on books, again, whether some or none or all of us have read them. Because like everyone reading books takes different things away from them, but there's still enough of a common ground to have these conversations sort of build impressions of books and authors. And so this taxonomy is very close. In fact, I suspect Bayard knows about and may have based it on the idea of you have a trichotomy of the objective, the subjective, and the intersubjective, which is typically developed in this order. And you might say, well, your impressions, like the collective impressions of books and their relation, is a subjective fact, but I would say it's actually an objective fact about social reality. And so the underlying reality is what the books actually say, but the social reality, and I keep mentioning I want to make a video on the map versus the territory, which I think is an important idea that not enough people know about, but I have a lot I want to say and not many obvious books to talk about in that context, so I keep putting it off. But one of the things I want to mention when I do that video is that the social reality is the social territory, but it also contains maps of the physical reality. And I'll get to that in that video. But anyways, so the collective library, sort of our impressions of books and how they relate to each other, like as a collective society, is the objective layer in social reality in this case. And then the inner library is the subjective, your impression of a given book. And then the virtual library is the intersubjective. And again, I'm sure that the author of this book knows that and may have developed this intentionally, but doesn't use those terms. And so when he's talking about the collective library, he talks about how it is sort of important to understand the relations of books to each other. And that is something that I've had a better impression of than average, but I've really been actively trying to develop in the last few years. And let's see, what he says about it is then hardly important if a cultivated person hasn't read a given book, for though he has no exact knowledge of its content, he may still know its location, or in other words, how it is situated in relation to other books. This distinction between the content of a book and its location is fundamental, for it is this that allows those unintimidated by culture to speak without trouble on any subject. And so when it comes to academic topics, people, if anything, tend to overestimate me. And so I've never had insecurities about that. And another video I want to make is on counter-signaling, because I also actually try to play down, which I think it's Henry Hitching, so it's the second book, sort of talks about, is people who are secure in this way, but also often inaccessible to people, focus more on trying to appear accessible, which is definitely something I do. But I also think, like, I don't have a normal audience. And another video I want to make, I haven't mentioned, I don't dislike normal people because I fundamentally like there's not even common ground. So people who watch my videos who don't immediately click off are unusual in some way, almost certainly. And so this whole thing that I had of, these sort of 4, probably more, literary figures from the boomer generation, that I clustered them all together because they came from that time, and I don't even know if it was the same people again, just that the kinds of people who talked about them from my parents' generation tended to be the kind of people who annoyed me, that I sort of grouped Norman Mailer, Gore Vidal, John Updike, and Susan Sontag together. And the one that I had the strongest impression of was Norman Mailer, and it was mostly a negative impression. And I don't know, so it's clear from reading Sontag that she is nothing like my impression of Norman Mailer, which doesn't mean that my impression of Norman Mailer is accurate. And I'm wondering if Gore Vidal and John Updike are also similarly distinctive and worth reading. So I realized I didn't actually end up explaining why it was What About Gore Vidal had to do with the Lady of the Library book haul video. And the answer was that in her thumbnail, I saw she had a book by Gore Vidal, and I was curious to see her talk about, even as a book haul, books she hadn't read, what she knew about Gore Vidal, which was no more than I do. She basically, from what she said, just knows him as a famous novelist. I mean, she might know more, but that was all the indication she gave in the video. But I clicked on it for that reason, and I ended up, she talked about these 2 books, which intrigued me again. And so I like this book a lot better than this book, because this one talks about sort of, it's developing general principles from specific examples. And this one, so this one's written by a French guy. This guy's written by an English guy complaining that this book is too French and isn't really answering the question. And so this book, I feel like a more accurate title would be How to Talk About Specific Books You Haven't Read, because most of this is, he is picking books to talk about that he sort of thinks an educated person at the time in the context he was writing would be expected to know, and giving basic overviews of them for 20 chapters. And this sort of reminds me, actually, because I've had at least a few comments of people complaining about the name of my channel and being like, when are you going to actually explain how to develop reading as a skill? Which I'm sure Idris Shah, who I reference a lot, has a story about this, but I'm drawing a blank on a good example. But it's equivalent to me to, like, imagine you ask me, hey, teach me how to grow strawberries or cucumbers. And so I'm showing you how to garden, how to till the soil, how to plant seeds. And you're saying to me, hey, when are you going to teach me how to grow strawberries? When are you going to teach me how to grow cucumbers? Which, like, people, I think, in English-speaking cultures expect a sort of explicit instruction, which really only works for people who have those same sort of assumptions and aren't very imaginative. And for me, I have found explicit instruction tends to lead me wrong. I tend to take the wrong thing away from it. And the kind of more implicit, more theoretical stuff, as in this book, is a lot more helpful to me, even though I come from an English-speaking culture. And so I actually kind of found this book a bit of a chore to read at times. So a lot of it was covering stuff I already knew, and even when it was covering stuff I didn't know, I'm like, I don't care about this. I forced myself through, and as I was doing that, I'm thinking, it would be on point to stop the book halfway through and be like, hey, I didn't finish reading How to Really Read Books That You Haven't Read. But I was curious how he was going to develop it, because the chapters are very uneven. Some of them I thought were interesting, some of them I thought were really bad. And one of them in particular I thought was really out of place, which is, this was written in 2007, and so he has How to Talk About the Quran, if you haven't read it. And he's basically sort of pushing the softer version of the Islam as a religion of peace narrative that all the elites were sort of pushing at that time, and focusing on claims he'll make about in the Quran that aren't there. But a lot of these things, like, I am, for a non-Muslim, non-academic, probably considerably better informed on especially Sunni Islam than the average person. Sunni Islam and Alevism, which is a sort of heterodox Shia sect, and then Twelver Shiism, Ismailism, Zaydism, Ahmadiyism, Alawitism. I know less about those, although still probably more than the average person. Ibadiyism too. But I know a decent amount on Sunni Islam and to a lesser extent Alevism. And like a lot of these things that he's saying they're not in the Quran, I'm like, okay, but they are in the Hadith. And the thing about the Hadith is not all the Hadith are equally reliable, and not all of them are accepted in the same way by different schools. But some of these things he's talking about, I'm like, I think they are in the Hadith. And so it's one of these things that I think the kind of person who's going to take this advice at face value is going to sort of be assuming this anyways. And the kind of person who is going to question it, it's going to backfire, especially with people who don't know a lot about Islam, but sort of know that a lot of that post 9/11 narrative that was sort of pushed by elites was wrong. And it feels really shoehorned in here as well. Like most of the chapters, there is a logical progression at least. Whereas here is like, okay, after the Bible, I'm going to talk about the Quran, and then after the Quran, I'm going to talk about Proust. So I realized that I sort of went on a tangent and didn't actually explain what it was that felt so out of place about the Quran chapter. And this is purportedly a book about basically what Pierre Bourdieu would call academic capital, like sort of showing off your knowledge of books, and especially in relation to what Pierre Bayard called the collective library. And the Quran isn't really in the collective library in the same way. And on top of that, Hitchings is like, well, you shouldn't claim to have read the Quran unless you read it in Arabic, which, I mean, that is the traditional Islamic interpretation. The Quran in Arabic has a lot of wordplay that you're losing. But also, at least traditional Sunni Islam will say, like, you can't really interpret the Quran until you've had extensive legal training anyways, and then you need to follow one of the 4 main Sunni madhabs. And so, like, this idea of, okay, you should know this stuff about the Quran from a guy who doesn't really know much about it. And then, I guess, in the sense of this was sort of the attitude of the like elites at the time, maybe this is useful information, but for me, it just stands out as it's bad information that doesn't work today. And if you want to talk about the impact of Islam on Western culture, there are better examples than the Quran. And so, like I've noticed, there are really 8 people who are not Muslim and not scholars of Islam or comparative religion tend to talk about when it comes like main sort of Islamic thinkers. And 5 of these are people who I see people talk about as influenced, but they don't really read much. So there's Ibn Battuta, who is sort of the Arab Islamic Marco Polo, and Al-Khwarizmi, who algorithms are named after him, and major Persian mathematician. I learned about both these in high school. And then you have the 3 big like Islamic Aristotelian philosophers of Avicenna, Averroes, and Al-Farabi, who, if you notice, we use the Arabic name, even though he had a Latin name, Al-Farabi, which sort of shows he's less well known, but these three still had a big impact on Western interpretation of Aristotle, although not a lot of people read them today. And it's only now, like, translations were hard to find even 10 years ago, and now you can find them, but they're often pricey, so they're still not, like, you don't have a lot of Penguin classics from these people. And then the three that people actually read, that I see people talking about reading, are, so the first of them is just this mainly one book, Al-Muqaddimah by Ibn Khaldun, which I have not read. So I want to be clear, it's always high on my TBR, but like never the next thing I end up reading. Plus the text is annoyingly small, which I got this one years ago, and most of my Princeton classics have better text, so I don't know if I were to get another copy if it would be better, but of course I don't want to buy a second copy just to see if they improve the text. But the main thing you have to know about this book that I know having not read it, like in terms of how people reference it, is the idea of asabiya, sort of tribal cohesion, tribal unity of the elites, and then also the idea of circulation of the elites, and this is considered like the first big work of sociology, by the way. And that is, so asabiya generally in the Arab Berber world generally lasted about 4 generations, then you'd have a new tribal dynasty replace them, which I talked about this book, Shadow Empires by Thomas Barfield, and he said that Ibn Khaldun's interpretation really only applies to egalitarian tribal societies, and hierarchical ones, like the sort of the Turco-Mongol culture, actually, that lasts a lot longer. And there is sort of a big split in, like, you have, like, West Africa, East Africa, and Southeast Asia are sort of peripheral to Islam. And then in the main Islamic world, you have this sort of cultural split between, like, the Arab Berber cultural region and the Turco-Persian tradition, which I'm thinking maybe I should actually try to make my own video, because there's a lot that I could talk about in terms of Islam from a perspective that is unusual, because I'm not a Muslim, not a scholar of Islam, but also not like a atheist or like anti-Muslim like activist type, so I have an unusual, anyway, maybe I'll do that. But then the last two people of the three that I see people actually read, so both of these are sort of Sufis, Islamic mystics, and that's why people read them. And so one of them is Rumi, better known in the Muslim world as Mevlana, or at least in Turkey as Mevlana, who was a Turco-Persian poet, and I mean, a lot of other things, but he's basically known for his poetry. He's also sort of a big Sufi mystic as well. And this book, so I have several works, or several collections, like translation of his work, that are not, any of them I don't think are translations of a single work of his, but they're compilations. And this one is a collection of his love poems, which is the, generally when I see people referencing Rumi, it's his love poems. So this is probably, if not this, books like this are probably what people who read Rumi, what they're most likely to read, assuming they're reading them in English. And then finally we have Al-Ghazali, who I've read some of his stuff, but not this book, The Incoherence of the Philosophers, which is probably his best known. I don't know if it's his most read, but it's certainly his best known work, because this was often seen as the work that sort of took Islamic intellectual culture from being an academic, sort of rationalistic, analytical culture to being a more traditional and mystical culture. And people have differing opinions on whether that is a good thing, so he's kind of a polarizing figure. But so these three figures, Ibn Khaldun mainly from Al-Muqaddimah, and then Al-Ghazali mainly with Incoherence of the Philosophers, and then Rumi mainly with his love poems, are the three people I actually see reading. So if you want to seem knowledgeable about Islam, talking about these three people, and maybe the other 5 I mentioned, are going to be a better way to go than talking about the Quran. And it was also, like at the end, he mentioned some of the writers he skipped. And one of the writers he skipped was John Milton, who, Paradise Lost, like that was my white whale, because I was trying to read it, but I struggled with verse. And I think, in hindsight, maybe what I should have done is read it aloud. I'm realizing as I've been reading more poetry, which is, I'm going to make a separate video on that, but I have been, so there is this YouTuber I often watch, Randy Ray, the Literate Texan, and he recently said that he was trying to do the Ray Bradbury challenge, I think it is, where you read a short story, an essay, and a poem every night for 1,000 nights. And I'm like, there is no way I'm doing this for 1,000 nights, but it seems like a neat idea, so I'm going to try to do that. And I've been doing this for like a week. And most of the short stories I've been reading have come from here, this big book of classic fantasy edited by Jeff and Ann Vandermeer, which I read their big book of classic science fiction years ago, and finally reading this, a lot of authors you wouldn't think of as being fantasy writers. And I sort of set a rule for myself that for the time being, I'm not reading science fiction short stories and I'm not reading fairy tales, because I read those anyways. I don't actually read a lot of fantasy short stories, even though they're adjacent. I figure that's a good starting point, and it's convenient to just have the one book. And then as I mentioned, like the recent video on essays, I've been reading a lot more essays anyway, so that's pretty easy, although I've been trying to mix it up, and I'm asking myself, hey, is there a short essay by someone I have essays by that I haven't read yet? or I haven't read many essays by them and read more. And then poetry, again, sort of similar thing. And the interesting thing about that is that doing it this way is sort of situating me more like it's sampling these people a little bit is giving me much more of a feel for what people believed and like differently. Like I have here actually, because I have a second channel that I started that I'm going to do readings on, and I have one that I need to do a little bit of editing. Like I missaid one word and I need to figure out how to fix that. And then I want to read an essay by Emma Goldman, which is interesting because it goes sort of so against how I understand left anarchism, and especially like Bakunin or Proudhon, that, I mean, it's fascinating, and I want to put that on the readings channel. Anyways, and so like there's been a lot of that, is a lot of writers that I've been reading essays by them, they surprise me, or they're short stories too. And it's interesting because you realize like a lot of these older writers, like we tend to think of as writers, you do one thing, right? You're a journalist, and maybe you write some nonfiction books related to what you investigated, or you're a fiction writer and you write in either literary fiction or in a given genre. But older writers were, I guess the term was maybe men of letters, don't know if that's quite accurate, but they would write fiction, they would write poems, they would write essays, they would write criticism. They would do all sorts of things in a way that modern writers do less, that I have sort of been doing a bit of it. I'm like, I need to do this more. I think we need to bring this back. But anyways, so all of that conversation is sort of coming out of Henry Hitchens. And I was talking about, right, Paradise Lost, where what I've realized is a lot of these poems, I have a much easier time understanding them if I am reading them aloud as opposed to reading them on the page, especially if they're longer poems. And I'm like, maybe that is how you read Paradise Lost. So it's fascinating to me that he's like, Paradise Lost isn't even worth discussing except as a mention at the end. And also, in the beginning of the book, he has 5 books that basically he says no one ever reads. And so one of them is Finnegan's Wake by James Joyce. And then he has a list of 4 more. And one of them is The Man Without Qualities, that is actually the first book in this book, and I feel like is maybe Hitchens sort of throwing a bit of shade at him. One of them is, I think it's something like A History of Melancholy, or Melancholy of History, something like that. And then another one is Mein Kampf, which I feel like that one is kind of different than the others. Like, I can't imagine anyone would claim to be familiar with Mein Kampf who hasn't actually read it. Like, that is not going to give you sort of social credit, social prestige, social capital. And then the last one that he talks about is Pilgrim's Progress, which I actually have read because it is a very foundational text to English literature, and it is a slog and a shorter read. And the interesting thing is the imagery is vivid, and I think illustrated it's helpful. I don't know if it would help to read it more in verse, but I'm like, yeah, I can see why people wouldn't read Pilgrim's Progress. And I will say, like, I have mixed feelings about Hitchens' book, because it's like a mixture of what I would think of as very mid-wit takes, combined with a curiosity and like insights and an investigative method that I'm like, this is actually inspirational. And so one of the things that he did is he actually went and he asked all his friends, hey, what books do you consider unreadable? And there's an impressive list of a wide variety of books, some of which I've read. And he also tries to ask, well, what books are actually like important, like scientifically? And so 2 of the ones he mentions, obviously, are Origin of Species, which I've read, and Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith, which I'm reading through very slowly. Another one he mentions that I'm realizing it wasn't even on my radar, but it should have been, is On War by Clausewitz. And I ordered a Wordsworth classic that'll be coming soon, but I don't have it yet. That was $5. And I'm like, hey, $5, good to have this book, because it's right, it is a classic, and it wasn't on my radar. But basically, so I do think, I find Bayard more helpful, and I'm going to actually go back and I'm going to reread this probably sometime soon, or at least reread some of these sections. I'm also going to probably try to read The Man Without Qualities. I'd like to think I'm going to read it at some point. So I went and I looked it up, and The Man Without Qualities by Robert Musil, not Muesli, that's like the granola cereal thing, is like 2,000 pages. So that's, I guess, why not many people actually read it. Maybe I'll try to read it someday, but I'm going to wait until I read The Count of Monte Cristo at a comparatively short 1,200 pages. But it is interesting. So in here, like the books that he bases this on 12 works of media, and only 2 of them are ones that I have directly like experienced. One of them is Hamlet, which I read and I've seen at least a couple of stage productions of. One of which is Groundhog's Day, so it's the only film on the list. But in terms of the actual books he's referencing, I haven't read. I have read some stuff by Umberto Eco, but not Name of the Rose, which is behind me. And I have read some stuff by Oscar Wilde, and actually in that case, I think he's referencing Importance of Being Earnest, which I haven't read, but I've seen several times. My mother, friend of hers, she does like local community theater back in my hometown, and she loves Oscar Wilde's Importance of Being Earnest, so she's done at least 2 productions that I've seen. My mother mentioned recently that she's doing another one that obviously I'm not there to see it. She's also the reason that I'm familiar with, for example, I mean, I learned about Bertolt Brecht in undergrad because I took a directing class, but aside from that, like, the only reason I knew about him before then is because she did one of his plays that I saw, The Resistible Rise of Umberto Oui. So I've been thinking about sort of, again, one of the things I try to do is, like, I have no shame, no concern about people thinking I am culturally illiterate or Philistine, because the people who do that are going to show more about themselves. And it's actually interesting because on a video that I want to do a follow-up to at some point, but on sort of why I don't think left-right is the most important sort of socio-political distinction, I had 2 comments, one of which was basically saying, horseshoe theory, your argument is invalid. And I'm like, I was not advocating horseshoe theory, I was criticizing it, which shows you didn't watch the video at all. Actually, it's one of the few negative comments I actually responded to in a snarky way ever. And then one of them was saying, all of these are people I haven't heard of, so your argument is invalid. And I'm like, that's an interesting argument, right? Is the assumption that, hey, if I haven't heard of these people, they must not be useful because I know everyone there is to know. And so Henry Hitchings, I think, does more talking about people do take often a perverse pride in not having read certain books. And in his case, he's talking about, like, it's often like the scientific books, like people take pride in having not read books on physics or stuff like that, right? And that actually made me think I should probably read Stephen Hawking's A Short History of Time, which he mentioned, because I've heard about that. Also, Carl Sagan's book, which might be one of the books I have for my father, I'll have to see. I forget what it's called, but it's, I think, is it Cosmos? And then you also have people sort of taking pride, and I did a, like, post getting feedback that I need to actually read that, respond to people, it was like a month ago now, asking for examples of books that are commonly read and referenced by midwits, but are actually good and useful books. And I gave as examples, 2 obvious examples are Thomas Sowell and David Graeber, where, yeah, a lot of the people who reference them are, and when I talk about a midwit, I'm talking about someone who, they're a little bit smarter than average, a lot better educated than average, and then their ego about their intelligence and their knowledge is way higher than average, and they have like a huge degree of arrogance about, I know all that I need to know. And so you'll see often pride in not having read books like that, not having read pop books in general, or what might be called airport books. And then you do also see sort of an interesting dichotomy between, and Pierre Bayard actually talks about this a little bit too, there's a book where there is a guy who writes Westerns, and he's mistaken for like a literary fiction guy. And the fact that he has this reputation and is recommending these Westerns to people, they take him seriously because of his reputation. It sort of gives them license to read those books. And that's something I'm sort of trying to do with the channel is, yeah, there's going to be people who don't know me who are going to be like, okay, yeah, you're full of it. But I'm not worried about those people's judgments because they're not my audience anyways. And I'm hoping, as someone who has the academic capital to read books that people would consider trashy, do that. And conversely, I think it's helpful to be able to acknowledge sort of a similar thing where I have the cultural capital to admit I haven't read famous books. And so actually, before I get into that, I want to talk about an idea that both of these books talk about, although this book gets it from this book, which is there is this game called Humiliation, and the way it works is everyone in the group, you name a book that you haven't read, and you get a point for every person in that group who has read it. And in the context of the novel, the guy wins by having not read Hamlet, but then he loses his job as a professor. And I've been thinking about, like, if I played this game, what books could I use to actually win this game? And I think the obvious examples would be To Kill a Mockingbird, which I still want to read at some point, but that's one of those books that everyone reads in school that I just happen not to. And similarly, Ender's Game, which I don't even have because I'm not planning on reading that one. If I'd done this a year ago, I could have done Great Gatsby too, but now I've read that. And I also think another interesting one, because these are books that people mostly read in high school, I don't think there's this same social stigma to not having read them, and it's kind of a cop-out. And I'm like, what is the best known book that people might actually judge me for, that I might actually get like high points, because there's books I haven't read that people might judge me for having not read, but most people won't have read them. And I think a good candidate for that is Dune. And I read the first 100 pages, high school, I think. And it was, we were traveling to Albany for my mother, friend, child's bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah. I forget which one, but it's the Jewish coming of age thingy. And so I was, like, a lot of people around reading it in sections, which might not be a good way to read it. Although I've also sort of heard, that one's interesting because before the movie came out, it seemed like only people in my parents' generation had read it, and I didn't know anyone my generation who have, but it seems like a lot of people read it because of the movie now, and that might be one that I could actually do well in this game. But I think it's sort of misleading, and it leads us astray when people try to pretend they're more familiar with books than they are. And I try to always be very clear about how much I've read books, although I realized one thing that I don't. So if there's a book that I've read parts of because it's like a collection of essays or short stories, when I'm listing, like in the description, I usually note if I haven't finished a book. I do this thing with nonfiction where I will often read the introduction and first chapter, and I don't count those as even partial, I'll note them as not read, because I'm just reading that to get a sense of, as Bayard would say, the location of these books in relation to other books, like what the argument is and who they might be connected to. But I don't, in my links, mention, like, if it's a collection of essays or short stories, or if it's a very modular book that people are not likely to read the whole thing cover to cover. I don't mention that I haven't read that whole thing because I sort of assume, like most people won't have and won't assume that, but I do want to make clear, like, if it's a collection of essays or short stories, there is a good chance I have not read even like half of them. But anyways, so another good passage from Bayard that I want to read is, "To speak with shame about books we haven't read, we would thus do well to free ourselves of the impressive image of cultural literacy without gaps, as transmitted and imposed by family and school. For we can strive towards this image for a lifetime without ever managing to coincide with it. Truth destined for others is less important than truthfulness to ourselves, something attainable only by those who free themselves from the obligation to seem cultivated, which tyrannizes us from within and prevents us from being ourselves." And so that is like one. I've made a number of videos about books I haven't read, and those don't do well, so I stopped doing that. But I still encourage people to be open about what books you haven't read, and it's sort of an uphill battle, right? Because I'm someone, it's easier for me to say because most people who get to know me are, it's sort of like that Western writer who is thought to be like a literary fiction writer, where he has the credibility that people are going to say, oh, maybe this is okay to admit, as opposed to maybe you're a fool. So I know it's easier for me to say, but I'm still sort of trying to do what I can to set that example. But I mean, the main thing that I sort of wanted to talk about here is this idea, I mean, a lot of interesting ideas, mostly from Bayard, of the collective library, the inner library, and the virtual library, as representing the socially objective, the subjective, and the intersubjective. And the idea of some degree of like literacy as understanding the locations of books. And this comes in the context of The Man Without Qualities. There is a librarian who hasn't read pretty much any books. He only reads the catalogs of books and their tables of contents, because, as Bayard notes, a decision to read one book is a decision to not read every other book in existence, at least at this time, which, this is why I always boggle at people who argue that people have obligations to do X, because doing X implies not doing an infinity of other things. And so you can make a case that people have an obligation to not do X, I think, much better than that people have an obligation to do X. And so I wanted to quickly clarify that there is a distinction between what are called thick relations, which are like your friends, your relatives, your local community, and your thin relations. But the people making this argument generally don't draw a distinction and argue that if you should do this for thick relations, you should do it for thin relations too. And they often make arguments for doing stuff that most people don't even do for thick relations. And what you sort of should do as a positive thing for your thick relations tends to be based on community norms and like intuitions, like sort of our own moral reasoning and like negotiations. Could probably make a whole video on that, but I don't have a specific book on thick or thin relations to point to that. I still might make a video on it, but anyways, wanted to clarify that when I'm talking about this, I'm talking about it coming in the context of people who claim that everyone has like a moral obligation to everybody, which is a completely non-workable thing. And one of the reasons it's not is there's so many things you could do, whereas with your thick relations, these obligations with a handful of people are much more manageable than trying to make these universalistic, as well as just going against human nature to try to do this. And it's a similar thing, like, I don't want to say you have an obligation to not read certain books, but I do try to think about, is a book going to be worthwhile to me? And I don't actually have any fixed examples of books that I definitely wouldn't read that I could name. I can say, obviously I haven't read and I probably will never read Twilight or A Court of Thorns and Roses or anything by Colleen Hoover. I'm aware that they exist. I am not the target audience for those, and nothing I've heard about them makes it sound like there is any value in me for reading them, at least greater than other things I could be reading. But that might change. There might be some reason I might read those. And I think the category of books that I would never read are the ones that don't even reach that level of prominence because they are very derivative. Like I mentioned in a previous video, that there was, when my cousins got married, my cousins live in Colorado, my mother rented for the family a whole mansion from Airbnb from this oil executive. And the family had a whole bunch of books, and they were all on either why their political views or why their religious views were right. And I think that kind of book of, hey, this is why you are right about what you already believe, targeted to a certain audience. I certainly don't want that for stuff I already believe, and for stuff I don't believe, I'm not the right audience, and I want to read stuff that is actually targeted at people who disagree with them. So I am probably unlikely to ever read anything from that category. But again, there's just, it's I don't have obvious specific books that I won't read, although I have books that I definitely will never read, because it's always dependent on context and what I think is relevant. And then the last thing that I wanted to mention, also from Pierre Bayard, is, so this is something that Idries Shah talks about too, is ultimately teachings and readings, they are only useful as a way to help figure out what you already know or what you're already grasping at, kind of. There's another great passage from Bayard. The paradox of reading is that the path towards ourselves passes through books, but that this must remain a passage. It is a traversal of books that a good reader engages in. A reader who knows that every book is just the bearer of a part of himself and can give himself access to it, and only if he has the wisdom not to end his journey there. So yeah, so these are both books that I would not have even thought to read before having a BookTube channel, because I'd be like, why do I need to read a book like this? I already have my own way of talking about books I haven't read, which is I acknowledge I haven't read them, and I talk about what I've heard about them. And I want to think about this concept more, and also about the idea of literacy and what it means to be well read, but I wanted to sort of talk about these two books. And I'm probably going to reread Bayard. I don't think I'll reread Hitchings, although he had some interesting ideas. And I do like his idea of asking people, what books do you consider impenetrable? I'm I should be doing more of that with people I know, that kind of question. So I think he has some mid-witty takes, but he's also curious in a way that is interesting. And so one other thing that I realized I wanted to mention here about this book that is actually a good point that Henry Hitchings raised is that there is an opportunity cost to reading books that is generally greater than the cost of actually buying books. And he says this is why people who read a lot tend to have a lot of unread books, which is not always true. I mentioned family friend, almost third parent, doesn't do that. My mother reads more than most people and also doesn't do that. But a lot of people who read a lot tend to do this. And that's why, because he talks about you can get, especially even if you're getting a hardcover and you're paying at the time he wrote this $20, which I know they're now often $30, but then also on Amazon they'll often be $20 or even less. Then that is at minimum wage in the US. I don't remember what it was in Britain. That's $7 something an hour. Let's call it $7 an hour. So that's 3 hours. And there are hardcovers that you can read in that time. But I've been thinking about I'm a fast reader, and there are a few books in my collection that if I was basing my time on minimum wage, the cost of the book is more than my time to read it, but I don't value my time at minimum wage. And so I have literally no books in my collection that I paid a lot. I don't think I've had any books that I paid over even $100 for. And the ones that I paid the most for have tended to be thicker books as well. Yeah, so I don't think there's any books in my collection that would cost me more in terms of my value on my time and energy to read them than the cost of the book. And this actually came up for me, and I'm trying to read Pareto, and I'm trying to read him unabridged while talking about it might make more sense to suck it up and buy the $75 abridged version. I got the unabridged version for $20. But anyways, wanted to point out, and obviously libraries do exist, but part of the reason I argue for having books you don't read, and I made a video on this topic and also a playlist you can check out, is because of the whole, it generally costs less to buy a book than it does to read it, although then there's also storage and moving costs as well. And also the cost of annoying if you live with people. But anyways, yeah, so this one by Pierre Bayard. I think I'm very glad I read, and I would not have read it if I wasn't doing the channel, even though I think I would have benefited from it if I wasn't doing the channel. This one by Henry Hitchings, I would almost certainly have DNF'd if I wasn't doing the channel, but there are some interesting insights in it. And if you want sort of an overview of what books, because a lot of them are still relevant today to people's idea of cultural literacy, but most of it was, again, stuff I already knew. Like, he had a list of various phenomenon that come from books, and I knew basically, I think, every single one of them, which, and I imagine a lot of my viewers would too, so I don't know how useful this would be for the kind of person who watches the channel, but I would definitely recommend this one, How to Talk About Books by Pierre Bayard. So anyways, I mentioned a few videos I want to do, and I'm probably going to do a follow-up, at least one follow-up video on this, talking about the idea of cultural literacy and what it even means to be well-read, what books you would read to achieve that. But I do think one of the important ideas is the understanding that it's useful to have read specific books, but it's also useful to understand the location of the books in relation to other works as opposed to just their content. Oh, and one thing I wanted to note is I've been making playlists of my videos. I tried at the start of the channel, I was trying to anticipate what I would make and make playlists, and that wasn't working because I couldn't really figure it out. But now going back, having made a lot of videos, and I'm trying to not overlap unless I have a good reason, so I'm trying to decide, for the most part, video will go in one playlist or another. But if you haven't watched some of my older videos, you can check out. I'm also making a list of these lists that as I make more, I will rearrange on the main channel page. And if you want to click at the end of this video, I will have a playlist for my videos that are sort of more explicit instruction on my thoughts on how to develop reading as a skill, which some people have complained about or questioned. And as I've said, I feel like I'm sort of trying to lay the groundwork and explain a lot around it. But if you are interested in more explicit question of that, because this video itself is a little bit, I think, in that vein, you can check it out over here. Anyways, thanks for watching. I'm Magpie, and I'll see y'all in the next one.